Well, tonight I want to talk to you about my idea of nature's best hope. By the way, I got my PhD at University of Maryland, if that counts for tonight. But before I do that, I want to talk about one of Edward L. Wilson's books, came out in 2016, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. E.O. Wilson is I think most people would agree, he's been the most impactful biologist, ecologist of our time. He writes a book every single year, and this is the one he wrote in 2016. He's 92 right now, so that's an accomplishment. But throughout his very long career, he has been extremely interested in trying to save biodiversity on this planet. And in this book, he says, well, if we're going to save biodiversity anywhere, we have to save at least half of the Earth for it. We've got to save nature on half of the planet. And then he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And of course, conservation biologists think that's great. Let's save half the Earth. But a lot of people are scratching their heads saying, how can we possibly do that? We've got almost half of the Earth in some form of agriculture right now, and 7.8, 7.9 billion of us are in the other half, along with all of our detritus, all of our pavement, all of our airports, everything else. And we don't have a third half to put aside. So can we realize, has EO, gone crazy? Is this possible? And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I do think we can realize Wilson's dream. But in order to do that, we're going to need a new approach to conservation. You might remember in 2019, we had what we call an oak mast. Members of the Red Oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I am easily entertained. So I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, forced its head through there, and it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it plopped down. And that's a dangerous time for this insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it wiggles and squirms its way beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, stretches in all directions and forms a pupa, or forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. Looks like they have very long noses, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are down at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts and chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole. And that is how the larva gets into the acorn. So you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out in 1 year like most insects? And the answer is it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. After the larva has left the acorn, of course, it leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils in red oak acorns. And if scouts find a new hole, they get very excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it is time to move the colony. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move everybody in about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard to make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they will live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point? Very simple. That is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants that create the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll grab an acorn and fly up to a mile from the parent tree. And they tap it below the surface of the soil. Of course, their plan is to eat it during the winter, have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they're actually planting 3 oak trees. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they feed their young, carpenter ants. And if you don't have a lot of carpenter ants, you won't have a lot of pileated woodpeckers. And you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Facilia. That is the only pollen that species of bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over 1/3 of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. There's that Baltimore checker spot we heard about. You won't have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. So I could talk all night, all week, all year about nature-specialized relationships. The point is, though, that these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon and he stood on the edge, looked out over the wonderful view, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states. It's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves, and each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the amount of nature that we need to run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Now, you might wonder why we have done this. I wonder why we have done this. So I'll just guess. I suspect we thought that the earth, our nest, was so big, so vast that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. We did get away with that for a long time, but not anymore. We were wrong, and that's why we are seeing pretty scary headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years, almost a third of our North American bird population, already gone. Now the UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And I love the way they report it as if it's an option. Not an option, folks. You know, we removed 23 species from the endangered species list, 3 weeks ago, not because we've saved them, but because they are extinct. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, our environment, and this upon all of our houses, but that is not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from a lot of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if planet Earth lost insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. His message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappear, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, even many of our freshwater fish, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost our insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news here tonight, and that is none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. And we're going to have to change the way we landscape pretty soon. Why is that? Remember, humans are totally dependent on healthy ecosystems, on the life support systems that nature provides for us. We are products of nature. We cannot be living separately from it. We certainly can't kill it off without hurting ourselves. Here are just some of the things that plants produce, we say, for us. They actually produce for everything that's alive on the planet, like oxygen, like clean water, slowing its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, locking the carbon up in plant tissues, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. Plants build topsoil, hold it in place, prevent floods, dampen severe weather, convert sunlight into food. You know, without plants, we would have to eat sunlight. and that would be tricky. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. It never was a good idea, but today it's a downright terrible idea because of all those people, close to 8 billion people. We need more ecosystem services today than ever before. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent, wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups through the ages who've been able to do that. But for the most part, our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, then going to another area doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. And that's what he called the land ethic. What he never wrote about was developing a land ethic where we actually live.
Gosh, I thought that started at 6:30, but it did start.
Not sure why that was. But I suspect that the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist at the same time, in the same place, was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he probably didn't recognize it as an option. What I want to argue tonight, though, is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. Of course, in the past, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We certainly need to continue saving what's not destroyed, but we need to now save nature, actually recreate it where there are a lot of people, where we've already torn it apart, because that is almost everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Let's go back to private property. Most of the land's privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 98% of Texas is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail, because we'll be working in areas that are too small, too isolated, and too few in order to save the amount of nature that we need. Now, when I talk about conservation, I'm not talking about conserving what's not destroyed. We certainly want to do that, but there's not that much left. So we need to rebuild nature in all the places where we've torn it apart. And in order to do that, we have to rebuild ecosystems by putting the most functional groups back into these places. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the most powerful groups. We can add other species later on. And there's two groups that we cannot do without. One of them is the flowering plants. And of course, the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. Flowering plants, of course, are capturing the energy from the sun, turning it into food, storing it in their tissues. So now we have energy from the sun stored in plant tissues, mostly leaves. Well, most animals, most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. And it turns out that something is typically insects, but it's not just any old insect. Caterpillars are necessary to sustain food webs because caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we develop landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars in them, they will be failed food webs, failed ecosystems, and we will not have conserved that area. I'm going to give you an example from Carolina chickadees. That's the chickadee that we have around here. They, of course, are at our feeders right now. They're going to eat seeds all winter long. 50% of their diet during the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when they're reproducing, their babies cannot eat seeds. So they switch entirely to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And chickadees are not exceptions. 96% of the terrestrial birds in North America rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my students did a few years ago, Ashley Kennedy. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest. Send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items that are in the beaks of those birds, and then reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds as she could in North America. And she got thousands of pictures, did a lot of identifying. And this is a summary of her results. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families in North America, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen if we designed landscapes without enough caterpillars? Most of our birds would not be able to reproduce. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars. And one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is cuticle, it's exoskeleton, it's made of chitin, it's undigestible, and the birds don't want a lot of that. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. If you ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton compared to most other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have sharp edges. And finally, it turns out caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids, not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From what they eat, of course, but carotenoid content is not equal across the things that birds eat. There are far more carotenoids in caterpillars, these first two bars here, than there are in other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. It's the caterpillars that eat the green leaves where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting the caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough, or one or two a day enough? Well, let's go back to chickadees. There's a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, just to get that group of chicks to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of a bird that weighs 1/3 of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of birds. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think many of you do because we like chickadees, but that's about all that's left in so many places. So where else are they going to breed? You got to have all those caterpillars in your yard. They only forage about 50 meters from the nest when they're rearing young. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not create all of those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the data set, Rosenberg et al.'s Smithsonian data set, that says we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups: the species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like doves and finches, they actually make a milk out of seeds, and they can rear their young on that milk. They didn't lose any numbers in the last 50 years, but the species that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take away bird food, you lose the birds. So if we want birds, and if we want all the things I have not talked about that rely on caterpillars and other insects, we're going to have to change the goals or broaden the goals for how we landscape. Right now, we landscape exclusively for aesthetics, It's got to look good. Whether it does anything ecologically doesn't matter, because we used to think nature was someplace else. It's not someplace else anymore. So we now need to landscape in a way that supports the life around us, particularly those caterpillars. How do we do that? Well, we add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that make those caterpillars, which seems easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we're going to choose, and we have to be fussy about which plants we're going to choose because the caterpillars are fussy about which plants they're going to eat. And the monarch butterfly illustrates it perfectly. You can have all the Bradford pears, all the calorie pears, all the hostas, all the burning bush, all the camellias, all of the crepe myrtles, all of the things we typically landscape with from Asia in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to create a new monarch butterfly is milkweed. So if you take your milkweeds out of your yard, no monarch butterflies. So that's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like the monarch. Every plant lineage out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect species cannot adapt to all of them. So they pick one or two plant lineages that are really similar in how they protect themselves. And they get good at getting around the defenses of those particular plants. They develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure, the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history with those particular plants for all of those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do fall into place, the insect is locked into eating that particular group of plants. Which is why when you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, your monarchs don't start eating hostas. They can't. They're locked into milkweeds. And it's also why when we bring plants from other continents, and then when they escape our gardens and become invasive species in our natural areas, our insects can't eat them for the most part, and it devastates local food webs. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters if we're trying to rebuild the food webs that support the animals in the ecosystems that support us. We need to choose the plants that are going to do that. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well that works when we do choose the right plants. Starting with our own house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is where my wife Cindy and I moved. It was to a farm that was broken up. It had a very old farm, been farmed almost 300 years. The last thing they did before they broke it up and sold it into lots was mow it for hay. So there wasn't much there. And our goal, of course, was to attempt to restore the biodiversity that ought to be there, at least as much as we could. So in order to do that, you got to bring back the food webs that are based on caterpillars. And in order to do that, you have to have the right plants. So here's an example. I wanted to see if I could get Canadian owlets to make a living at our house. That's what a Canadian owlet looks like. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, in order to have Canadian owlets, you need meadow rue. So just like monarchs need milkweeds, Canadian owlets need meadow rue. It's the only thing they eat. And we didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure there was meadow rue where we lived hundreds of years ago before it was farmed to death, but the meadow rue is long gone. So I got some seeds, planted some meadow rue. I don't know of any meadow rue anywhere around us, but it grew very nicely. But you know, this was early on, and I wasn't all that confident the Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it. So maybe 2 months after I planted it, I walked by for another reason, and there were Canadian owlets all over it. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. This beautiful orange moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. I did know where there was some ditch daisy in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely. Took a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Bidens, but it did. And I've got a good population of both of those. So now we have 4 species on the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. I wanted hackberry emperor because, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. It's one of the species that ought to be here. And as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. And we didn't have any hackberry, so I planted it. It took 4 years for hackberry emperor to find my hackberry. I checked one of the branches in June. There were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on a single branch. So another big success. Now we've added 6 species, and that's how it went. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that has not come, the goldenrod flower moth. I'm not sure why it hasn't come. That's what its caterpillars look like. But this is part of fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I check for the goldenrod flower moth. One of these years I'm going to find it, and that'll be a great day. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. It's a great native plant. I hear people don't like it. I just don't know why. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It has good fall color. It's a good ground cover, makes nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. So right now our birds are eating Parthenocissus Virginia creeper berries because they're so high in fat. It's a great pollinator plant, believe it or not. The flowers that made those berries are small and inconspicuous. We don't even notice them except for the cloud of bees that are around them. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. It's not about how attractive it is for you. But I planted Virginia creeper because it supports the large sphinx moths that are an important component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted to see if I could get the double-toothed prominent at our house, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. I mean, even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. It's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm, which we didn't have. Of course, we lost elms to Dutch elm disease a long time ago, but there are 2 big, very big elm trees at the University of Delaware that make a good crop of seed every year. Got some of those seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely. It's been 19 years since I planted those elms. They're 80 feet tall at this point, and they attracted the double-toothed prominent right away, American elm. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, believe it or not, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that, Enethera. Moth came right away. It spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plant lineages I put on our property. I want to focus on oaks for a while, though, because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And that's a downside for a lot of people. I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if your oak has to be 400 years old before you can enjoy it, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is doing for you, what it's contributing to your ecosystem, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And right away, they started to rebuild that caterpillar moth-based food web that supports almost everything else by bringing in things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's Promolactis, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, excuse me, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, lesser oak dagger moth, greater oak dagger moth, streaked dagger moth, afflicted dagger moth. I'm sorry, I'm choking my way through my moths here. The crown bucolatrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotch heterocampa, oblique heterocampa, redline panapoda, laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on my tree, on my property. And they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. So you don't have to wait hundreds of years for your oak to start to rebuild that food web where you live. It'll start right away. This is what our house looks like today, or before the leaves fell, is what it looked like. I took this picture from the same place I took the first picture. Look, we have lawn. We're very traditional here, but I want to show you. We put a lot of plants back, and right away, as soon as we started putting plants back, those moths that drive our local food webs started coming. 4 years ago, I made it a goal to take a picture of every species of moth that is making a living on our property. I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,140 species of moths, and we have 10 acres. But Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we have 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird foods, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we saw last year. The World Wildlife Fund said Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I am sure we have increased biodiversity by at least 2/3, probably more than that. And it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. We just put the plants back. When you see terrible headlines like this, don't give up. Get angry. We can put it back together again if we don't wait till everything's already gone. But I know what you're thinking. We have 10 acres. A lot of people don't have that much land. Will it work on smaller properties? Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They live right in the middle of suburbia. They've got 0.6 acres, which is 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. The first thing they did when they moved into their property was remove their primary invasive species, which was bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle. They put in 75 species of native plants, plus a water feature they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. They're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. If any of you are birders, you know that's a good record. Just to compare it with our house, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So they are doing well on 0.6 acres. Yes, it works on smaller properties. What about urban yards though? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, that tower you see back there, that's O'Hare Airport. Over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural space. So she's a little island. It's a pretty island, but she is an island in Chicago. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature for the birds. And then she sat back and started to count her birds. And she's up to 120 bird species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. If you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. All right, there are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we need to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to reduce the area we have in lawn. We've got at least 40 million acres of lawn in the US. And by the way, there's more acres of lawn in Maryland than there are in all the park systems put together. That's a 2005 statistic. So you know it's bigger than that. 40 million acres is the size of New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. And I know why we need lawn. We need to advertise our high status, and we needed to put our Halloween decorations on. But what if we were to replant half the area that is in lawn? So what if we took an area like this and turned it into this? I got this picture the other day from Dan Getman in Missouri. That was a lot of lawn, and he's busy in the process of putting in a whole lot of native plants and making it very productive. If we did that in half the area in lawn, we could create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So we'll have the biggest national park in the country. What do you get when you put a park right where you live, or at least some part of nature right where you live? You get a chance to develop a personal relationship with that part of nature at your own time, your own pace. All you have to do is go outside. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park these days, 375 million people went to national parks last summer. So you're not seeing a lot of nature, you're seeing a lot of cars. It's also free. Homegrown National Park is free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is essential to developing that personal relationship with Mother Nature, not mediated by somebody else. And this is particularly important for our kids, our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying, you know, we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher and they drive for an hour and they go to a natural area and they walk around for an hour and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus and they go home, and that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and interact with it. Alone, no parental supervision. Let them work it out by themselves. They will come home. I guarantee it. It's so important because our kids are the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know what they're stewarding, how to steward, why they should steward, if they're terrified of nature, which is what the media does to them all the time, they're going to be lousy stewards. We can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii in a very modest patch of nature. It's a little patch of grass with a hedge. But there are no lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you disguise yourself with leaves and sticks so that the lizards can't see you coming. And then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay, but you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you get to know it, you take care of it. You learn how to be a good steward of that piece of nature. Form a personal relationship with that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture the other day, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of that. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranitzky's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and get yourself on the map. You know, Homegrown National Park is our idea to create through using social media, get the idea that everybody is responsible for Earth stewardship to go viral. We have two primary problems with the planet right now, two crises. We've got climate change and we've got the biodiversity crisis. Homegrown National Park is designed to address both of those, to get everybody involved, converting part of the property they own to native plantings. And what you do is you record your location, the amount of area that you're going to put in natives, or you already have planted in natives, or that you're preserving, and your little piece of your county will light up. And so what we want is the entire country to light up, but we get to see connectivity emerge. The object is to get beyond the choir. I've been talking to the choir for 15 years. We've got to reach all those people who don't realize that their piece of the earth is really important. And by the way, it doesn't cost anything. And some people say, are you using our data? I don't even know what that means. No, I'm not using your data. So get yourself on the map. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we put in the areas that are now in lawn? Well, I'm going to argue that at least some of those plants have to be keystone plants. What's a keystone plant? Well, what's a keystone? Here's the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take it out of the arch collapses. If you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they're making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. which means 86% of our native plants, they're contributing, but not all that much. They're not going to be what makes the difference. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s of the house. They're essential to hold it up. You can't build a house out of wallpaper. And that's what we've been trying to do for the last 100 years. You're not through building your house when you put in your keystone plants, but they're an essential part of it. So the question is no longer simply, are native plants better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But I can build an all-native landscape that does very little if I choose the plants that contribute very little. The question really is, do we want to use the most powerful native species, the ones that are supporting the most pollinators and the most caterpillars, or not? I used to get an email from I don't know if it was one person or more than one person saying, don't you know that ginkgo biloba from Asia actually grew in North America 7 million years ago, and that makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric we're using. It doesn't matter whether they're native. It matters whether they're doing anything. I don't care if ginkgos grew in the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars here today, which means they're not contributing anything to the local food web. They're there, they're occupying space, but they're not feeding anything. What is contributing more than anything else? Well, it's one of our oaks. Oaks support 557 species of caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic states, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. Just for comparison, tulip trees, great trees, tallest, straightest tree in the forest, they only support 21 species of caterpillars. So huge difference between keystone oaks and most of our other native plants. How do you know what are the keystone plants where you live? You go to, we're revamping the National Wildlife Federation website. It used to be Native Plant Finder, and that's still there. But now instead of organizing plants by county, which ecologically means nothing, we're organizing them by ecoregion. And we're also putting in the plants most important for specialist bees. So we're talking about keystone plants for caterpillars and specialist bees. So find out what ecoregion you're in. And this is right now designed for ecoregion level 1, which is not specific enough. So we're going to move it to level 2. But this is what a typical list will look like. Oaks are going to be number 1, followed very closely by native cherries, native willows, and so on. Notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows, native birches. If I go to the nursery and say I want to buy a cherry, undoubtedly they will sell me an ornamental cherry from Asia. If I want to buy a willow, they'll sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy a birch, chances are great it'll be one of the European birches, or a maple, probably be a Japanese maple. You got to specify that you want a native member of those very important genera, because if you don't get a native member, you're going to reduce caterpillar use by 68%. We've done that experiment. These are the top performing herbaceous plants, mostly perennials. Goldenrod's always very high. The various genera that asters were broken up into. Perennial sunflowers, very, very high, not only in terms of supporting caterpillars, but also in terms of supporting those specialist bees. When you're making a pollinator garden, you want to plant for specialist bees because the generalist bees, like honeybees and bumblebees, can use those plants as well. If you only plant for generalist bees, you lose all those specialist bees. If you have goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers in your yard, there's up to 44 species of bees that can be there as well that will not be there if you don't have those particular genera. This is the ecoregion number 1. As you can see, level 1, you can see it's way too broad. So we're going to move it to ecoregion level 2, and we'll be much more specific. So you're probably right here on the coastal plain, and that's the ecoregion that you should look at. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of research, particularly coming out of Europe, that supports the hypothesis that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect declines. These are all the ways that lights are killing our insects. But to me, this is good news, because we've got to turn around insect declines. We've already lost 45% of the insects on the planet. They're the little things keeping us alive. We cannot lose our insects. So if we can reverse that by flicking a switch at night, just turning out our lights, that's easy. We're getting off easy if that's all it takes. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn the light off over my garage or over my front porch because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it. So it only turns on when the bad man comes. And the first thing you're going to recognize is that the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb, the white light out of these lights and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED is the best because yellow wavelengths are the least attractive to nocturnal insects out of all the wavelengths out there. If everybody converted their white bulbs to yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects and millions of dollars too, because LEDs are a lot more energy efficient. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all of our insects. Actually, we're going to pay Mosquito Joe a lot of money to come kill all of our insects. This is a booming business around the country, and Mosquito Joe says it's okay because that is a natural product. It's pyrethroids. It's made from chrysanthemums. And he's right. It's a natural product. But so is cyanide, a natural product. So I'm not sure that's a good argument. He'll also say it only kills mosquitoes. And boy, I wish he was right about that. I don't know if you saw the big, it was last fall, big monarch kills from migrating monarchs that flew through Mosquito Joe, hundreds of dead monarchs on the ground. This kills all the insects it comes in contact with. The important point here, though, is it does not kill enough mosquitoes to make a difference. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. That's too hard. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50%. So he's not even close to actually controlling the mosquitoes, which is what he's supposed to be doing. And that's why he has to keep coming back and back and back and killing non-targets over and over again. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. And this is a good way to do that. Get a bucket. Everybody says, how big a bucket? I don't care. Get a bucket. And the bigger, the better. Fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay, and let it ferment for a couple of days. And of course, you're doing this in the warm weather. By fermenting it, what it's doing is building up populations of algae and diatoms that are eating the straw or the hay. But that is the perfect brew that attracts mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs, because that's what mosquito larvae eat, diatoms and algae. So any mosquito in your yard that's going to lay eggs will lay it in your bucket. You then go to the hardware store and get a mosquito dunk. It's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that kills aquatic diptera, and only aquatic diptera. You put one of these in your bucket and it will kill those mosquito larvae and nothing else. If you have a dragonfly that gets in your bucket, it's not going to hurt it. If your dog drinks it or the bird drinks it, not going to hurt it a bit. You might want to put a coarse screen over the top there so your local chipmunk doesn't jump in and drown. But if everybody did this, it would really take a bite out of those mosquito populations without killing anything else. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to develop landscapes that allow caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where this is just an example, but oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth caterpillar, complete the development on the tree. Caterpillar eats the leaves, spins a cocoon, hangs from a branch, then emerges as an adult, and then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. That's a safe place to be, is on the tree, but most things don't do that. Most of the species, 480 of them, 94% complete growing on the tree, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way underneath the ground to pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. And we mow and compact our soil under our trees so that it's rock hard and very hard for those caterpillars to get underground. So the typical way that we landscape becomes an ecological trap. We call in moths to lay their eggs. Caterpillars develop, they drop down and die. I am convinced that this is another major cause of insect declines wherever we humans are. And of course, the cement landscape is even more of a viable option. The good news is this is easily reversed. Now, this is what most people do. They have a tree in a yard and they've got their grass. We're just starting to measure how well insects complete their development, caterpillars, how well they complete the development in a situation like this. But I guarantee they will complete the development better in a situation like this, where you have a tree, maybe a dogwood here. You've got a layered landscape. These are safe sites. Caterpillar drops down. The soil is not compacted, can easily get underground, spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under there. Nobody's going to mow it. Nobody's going to step on it. Survivorship will be much higher. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral gardening. So we're not giving up any gardening here. As a matter of fact, we're going to do more gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put beds around your trees. Your trees will love it. It becomes safe sites for those caterpillars. You can use native ground covers liberally, like wild ginger or foam flower or ferns or May-apples. There's a lot of them. Speaking of ferns, this is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. These are red maple trees. Any caterpillar developing on these trees can drop down and complete their development in these ferns, even though it's the middle of a city. So we can do a lot better for our caterpillars by thinking about how we landscape under our trees. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, did her PhD right in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And the results of her study suggest that there actually is room for compromise on our plant choice. She worked with Carolina chickadees and asked one simple question. How well do landscapes that are typical suburban landscapes that are dominated by native plants support chickadee populations over time compared to landscapes dominated by introduced ornamentals? And the first thing she found is that when they're dominated by introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, we've reduced bird food by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So they all have nest boxes up, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there is not enough food here. We're not even going to try to lay eggs. If they did lay eggs, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. You might say, well, those aren't huge differences, but if you put all that together in a population growth model, as a function of the percentage of woody plant non-native biomass in your yard. So if you have no woody plants versus 100%, this is what you get. We look at woody plants because that's where chickadees forage. They don't forage in the grass or anything. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the chickadees have to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live very, very long. And if you reproduce at that rate, that's a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you make fewer, below the line here, you've got a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here is where those lines overlap, generously speaking, which means you can have up to 30% of the woody plants in your yard non-native without destroying the local food web. Now, you can't have invasives, no calorie pears, no burning bushes, no barberries, because those are ecological tumors. They just go, and you know what tumors do. But you can have your ginkgo, you can have your Asian azaleas, you can have your camellias, you can have your crepe myrtle. None of those are invasive, as long as they don't make up more than 30% of your landscape. So this is the area of compromise that I'm excited about, because if my message was we can't have any non-native plants, very few people would listen. This is a ginkgo. Let's go back to Dan's yard here. His wife loves ginkgo. So he added a ginkgo here. Does it destroy the productivity of his landscape? No, it's just a tiny fraction of the plants that are there. It's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It is the absence of native plants. So if we get more of these plants in the landscapes, we can tolerate more of these non-natives. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. I got this last spring. That's taken by a drone 400 feet up. That's a big garden, and you don't get more formal than that. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Remember, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It convinces your neighbors that it's not just a place, a patch of weeds that you forgot to mow. It's pretty. It services a number of bees. It's not very big, but if everybody did it, it would certainly help a lot. Remember why we need pollinators? The media will tell you we need pollinators because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's about a 12th of our crops. And people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Without pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Every place we need plants, which is every place. How about this? A Drew Lathan design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program. It's called the Lawn to Legume program that encourages homeowners. The state will pay homeowners to convert some or all of their lawn to appropriate Minnesota prairie plants, very popular. Pennsylvania has a new lawn conversion program. You get up to $5,000 per acre to convert your lawn to native plants. Florida, there's an island of Florida that's paying its residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written originally, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it, to be a good steward of that, rather than fine you if you do something with your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. St. Louis, Missouri, and Fayetteville, Arkansas had a bounty on calorie pears. You take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. And even public utilities are getting into the act. San Antonio water utilities giving people $100 coupons to put in water efficient native species rather than the old crepe myrtle and other things that require a lot of water. And of course, the big lawn conversion programs in California. Get up to $2 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you take out and replace with xeric plantings. California does not have one drop of water to spare on cool season European grasses. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one is a serious one. We've come to think of nature as if it's optional. We like it. It's entertaining. We like to visit it, but it's not essential. And that means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes the back seat. And resources are always in short supply. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me describes our society's view of conservation perfectly. We want to save wildlife, we want to save nature so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. These are wonderful places. We want to save them, preserve them so the future generations can enjoy them. And I get that, but it suggests nature's there just for entertainment. No wonder we don't think it's essential. Entertainment is not essential, but nature is essential. We need nature so that we have future generations, not just to entertain them. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation efforts just to areas that have very few humans in them, we're going to fail because those areas will be too small, too isolated, and too few in number to sustain the amount of nature that we need. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That's a Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's exactly what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I don't like that terminology because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, including our agriculture. So we need to glue our rugs back together again, folks. We got to put the plants back, not just to build biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to create viable habitats where we've destroyed them right now, where we live, where we work, where we play, where we farm. When we do this, it'll be the first time in modern history that we have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility to everybody on the planet, but I don't know why. Because everybody on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't we all bear the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? You know, we don't have the luxury of leaving conservation to the conservationists anymore. There are not enough of them. Stan Rushworth once said that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. And we're good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to planet Earth. It doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, the Earth's problems are huge, and so many people feel absolutely powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink their lawn. One person can remove their invasive plants. We didn't even talk about that. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can use keystone species. One person can turn out their lights. One person can totally revitalize the little ecosystem in their yard, which will then enhance their local ecosystem instead of degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. Just worry about the little piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, that's where you start. That's obvious. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a park, a preserve, help a land conservancy. They're all underfunded, all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power. We certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. And I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
I have a question. I know oaks, I planted an oak and it's probably dying right now, but it's very, very big. Are there smaller trees that you would recommend for the landscape?
There are smaller species of oaks, so you don't have to give up on oaks. Try the dwarf chestnut oak. It'll make acorns when it's 5 feet tall. Quercus prinoides.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to make a comment, Doug.
Yeah.
Ever since I first saw you some time ago, wherever I go, I just gather all the goldenrod, all the black-eyed Susan seeds, everything I can find, and with a garden rake, I just go to untended areas, scratch up a piece, and throw it in. And I do that all the time. It's great. I have so much fun.
So they're germinating and coming up, and it's working.
Yes, yes. And actually, along my side street, there was a curb and then a chain link fence. So I now have a garden 140 feet by 8 inches with all wildflowers and greens and, something to do.
Well, your local bees and butterflies are using those flowers. They don't care if it's 8 inches. It's there. They will use it wherever it is. So good for you.
Thank you. Thanks again for everything.
Hi, Doug. Have a planter under a bird feeder that's got all the wrong stuff in it. And you taught us so much. We're going to dig it up and put in native. We've used Mosquito Joe because we have such a terrible mosquito problem here. So I was very, very interested in the mosquito dunk. So we're going to give that a try, and adios, Mosquito Joe. Thank you.
Great. Good luck.
So Doug, there's a question that was in the chat window, and I was going to actually ask you the same question, but how can we pass this information on to our children? What's a good way of getting this down to in a presentation that's more friendly for the kids?
Well, I should make such a presentation, but I'll tell you one thing Timber Press is doing. They've hired somebody to rewrite Nature's Best Hope for middle schoolers. And we're just about done editing that. So that'll be available probably next year. And if your kids are younger than middle school, they've actually written it for kids even younger than that. So they'll have access to it that way. I know kids like to watch. They don't like to read, but reading's good skill to have. So one of these days, I really do need to make a few videos for schools and things. I just haven't done it yet.
So there was another question about non-native mulberries. Should they be cut down and try to plant native mulberries?
Okay, this is an exception. That's exactly what I did when I moved into our property. We had a big white mulberry. But I have learned since there are no native mulberries left here in the East, because for 300 years now, they have been hybridizing. And through introgression, the result of a hybridization between a red and a white mulberry is a white mulberry. The red is gone. You have to go to Texas to find true red mulberry now. So they both make good berries for the birds, and neither one of them supports a lot of other insects, and neither one of them supports hardly any caterpillars. So getting rid of your white mulberry to replace it with a red mulberry that you won't find, that will disappear through introgression and doesn't make a lot of caterpillars anyway, is probably just a wasted effort. So at this point, it's one of the non-natives that I would say just leave it alone, and it'll feed the birds with those berries during the summer. It's not going to make a lot of caterpillars, but either did the red. So.
Okay, and another question is, do you have an opinion on the importance of using a local ecotype of plant rather than simply a native species?
Local ecotypes are definitely better in that all the selection has already occurred that allows them to do really well in this latitude and this altitude. So you don't have to guess about it. When you buy a plant from someplace that you have no idea where it came from, there is some guesswork involved in that. So for example, I bought some beech trees. I bought some beech trees from a nursery in New Jersey that was going out of business many years ago. I assumed they were from New Jersey. Well, it turned out the seed stock was actually from way south somewhere, and those trees leafed out 2 weeks earlier than they should have. And then there was a frost and it kills all the leaves and it really sets them back. So a couple of them have died, but every year they struggle because it's a genotype of a good native species, but it's a genotype from far south of here. So provenance is important. But if I don't want to slow you down because of provenance. If your only choice is a plant from China versus one you're not sure of where it's from, go with the native.
Okay, Doug, we have another question. We have a lot of people in our area that live in condos and apartments.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any recommendations on plants they could put in containers that are for their decks?
Yeah, the containers, of course, are going to favor, they're going to mostly help the very mobile pollinators like our bees and our butterflies. So if you planted milkweed in containers, monarchs probably would use it. I've seen Joe Pieweed, particularly little Joe in big containers, does really well, attracts a lot of butterflies and bees. Are the asters, all the asters do really well in containers, and they're very good, particularly in the fall for the bees and for migrating monarchs. But another thing that people who live in condos and apartments might think about is look at the landscape of that building. If there are trees on that landscape, I bet there's not a good bed under those trees because the super doesn't want to deal with that. But you get permission to adopt that tree and create a bed and tend it under that tree so that any caterpillars on that tree can complete their development. That'll give you your own little private garden. You won't own it, but as long as you're taking care of it, it also keeps the mowers away from the tree. That's something that if everybody adopted a tree in the properties, you'd have a lot of good landscaping out there.
That's a great idea.
Doug, this is Stan Fisher. I have a lot of native plants that I plant, but I also have lawn, and I don't spray or fertilize the lawn, but I do mow it. And there's different plants all over the yard. There's clover, purslane, dandelions, violets, plantain. Does that count as for a pollinator area?
Well, it counts till you mow it and mow the flowers off. But notice I don't say get rid of the lawn. I say reduce it. Lawn is the perfect plant to walk on. So wherever you're walking in your yard, that's where the lawn should be. But if you can reduce the area that you're mowing, that would be great. But the fact that you're allowing things like clover, you know, when I grew up in the 50s, every lawn had clover in it, and there were bees all over the place. So that is definitely the way to go compared to the typical lawn today. If you put Scott's Turf Builder on your yard, there's a broadleaf herbicide in there that will kill all of those. So yeah, for the lawn you have, that's a great way to go about it.
Thank you.
Okay, another question from the chat window is, somebody doesn't care what they walk on, but they want to move around in their yard. What is the best way to replace grass with something to walk on?
Well, I guess what I just say, I wouldn't replace the grass where you're going to walk. It is the best plant to walk on. And it's, you know, it's okay. You can walk wherever you want in your yard. Most people don't spend any time in their yard, and those are the ones I'm really targeting. If you do want to get rid of your yard and you want to have other types of pathways, a lot of people put down wood chips. You'll have to do it periodically because they degrade and wash away. Some people put down stones. It depends on how big an area you're talking about. But there's nothing wrong with leaving lawn where you walk, because that is a great plant to walk on.
Okay, we have one more question so far in the chat is, what is your best advice for removing invasives?
Well, you have to kill the roots. So it depends on what the invasive is. Some of them can be pulled out and it's so traumatic that they really don't come back. Like, you know, for some of the bush honeysuckles. But you know, other things like autumn olive, if you leave any root at all, it will come up. And you'll be doing it forever. So you have to decide how you want to do it. But if you don't kill the roots, you'll be doing it forever. What I do, particularly for woody invasives, is to cut it off and then paint the stem with an herbicide. You're using very little material. It often is not enough to kill that plant, so it's not going to kill everything around you. But if you do it a couple times, you will kill the plant, and then you don't have to do it forever. So I consider that use of herbicides to be responsible and treat it like chemotherapy. You know, chemotherapy is, it's a poison you're putting in your body, but you need to do it to kill those tumors. And that's exactly what we have to do with these invasives.
A question. What can you do if you have a patch of ground that is almost always in the shade?
Okay, there are a number of plants that do well in the shade. So first of all, if you are looking for ground cover type of plants, most of those spring ephemerals are small, low plants. They're called spring ephemerals because they bloom in the spring before the tree leaves come out. So in the springtime, they're actually in the sun, and then they're happy in the shade the rest of the year. Many of the ground covers that I talked about, like wild ginger or Virginia creeper or ferns in particular, do well in shade. There are a number of blooming plants that will exist in shade. They just won't bloom because they need sun. If you're looking for shrubs, things like hydrangea arborescens it's the native hydrangea here, and it blooms quite well in shade. Now make sure you get hydrangea arborescens straight species. If you get Annabelle, which is the popular cultivar, that's actually a sterile flower, so it's not going to help the pollinators at all. But the straight species is a wonderful pollinator plant. So there are lots of options for you.
Thanks.
In many of the untended areas that I explore, there are large plots of English ivy taking over. I mean, like, you know, half acre. What can be done with something like that? Anything? It's
Well,
so
yeah.
dismaying.
You know, Oregon has banned the sale of English ivy because it's taken over the entire state. It's a tough one because wherever it goes, it lays down little roots. So, you know, some people just, well, that's when they'll compromise with their herbicide and say, I'm going to spray it because I can't get it any other way. But even then, it's a very waxy leaf, and you've got to put in a strong surfactant or it won't get through. It is one of our tougher invasives, but if you don't do anything, it just keeps growing.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Doug, I had one more question. Is there any native ground cover that even stands a chance to replace Japanese stilt grass? It's everywhere.
I know. It's everywhere at my house too. The only plant that I've seen can stand up to stilt grass is also really aggressive, and that would be Canada goldenrod. Now, it can get tall, like 3 or 4 feet, so you might consider that a ground cover, but you need something equally aggressive. Stilt grass is very, very tough because it's an annual, but it makes seeds at the top of its leaves, just the way most grasses do, but it also makes seeds down in its axils. So when you mow it, you're mowing off the top and you think you've prevented it from seeding, but it still is making seeds and it will come back every single year. So some people use pre-emergent herbicides on it. That works well, but that also prevents anything else from growing there that's an annual. If you've got a bunch of perennials, then that's a good way to control it. But just another one of these really tough problems that we have introduced by bringing in all these non-native plants. Okay, anything else? All right, then I will say good night.